This is our third video clip in our discussion about understanding fluctuations in our economy. And in this case, we mean short-term fluctuations where output measured usually by GDP fluctuates up or down depending on forces here inside and sometimes outside the economy. In our first clip, we established graphically a sort of framework to understand how to look at this, looking at how spending, particularly consumption, is driven by income and how there's an equilibrium level of output that's established, and we had a chance to look at that in a graph. In the second video clip, we looked at how changes in forces within the economy can change that spending relationship. In particular, we looked at how changes or increases in government spending can shift our consumption upwards and increase our resulting GDP by a factor of greater than 1 using a concept called the multiplier. In this third part, what we're going to be doing is looking at how the economy measures up against its best or full potential. So let's first define potential GDP. Potential GDP means that the economy is operating at its absolutely best. The automobile metaphor used here is that it's firing on all cylinders. We're making good, efficient use of all our scarce resources, and our unemployment level, as one example of one important scarce resource, our unemployment level is down to its natural rate. It's not zero. If unemployment was at zero, that would be quite stressful on the economy. But unemployment during potential GDP, unemployment is down at our natural rate, somewhere around 4 or 4.5%. It's also important to understand that potential GDP means a sustainable rate of output, something that the economy can continue doing for quite a while without stressing our scarce resources. Now, potential GDP is obviously a nice place to be, but there are times when the economy either falls short of potential GDP. In that case, we call that a recessionary gap. That's when GDP is operating below its potential. And there are times, temporary times, when the economy is red hot and it's operating actually above its potential GDP. It's actually has a higher output, but this situation, which we call the inflationary gap, is typically not sustainable. It can't continue for very long. In fact, it drives an inflationary spiral that has serious repercussions for the economy. Let's look at these using our now familiar graph. So here we have the same blue line we've had before. This measures planned spending. It has a constant and it has a slope, and it intersects with the red line, which is this identity. Remember, the identity is that GDP is measured through spending or output is identical to income. And so the resulting intersection of these two lines, where the red line and the blue line meet, establishes where we are. That's kind of an equilibrium level and establishes where our economy is operating at the moment. And we've marked it here with a dotted blue line. Now, our other line that has shown up on this graph is the green one, the vertical green line, and that represents potential GDP. That's a level of output, as we've described before, where the economy is working at its most productive, its most efficient, and that it's sustainable. If you think about a production possibility curve, potential GDP is operating right on the curve. Now in this graph, what we're seeing is that our actual GDP, measured by where the dotted blue line is below potential GDP. That means we're not operating at our full potential. Again, using a production possibility curve, that means we're operating within the curve. And that means there are some resources that aren't getting used efficiently. Typically higher unemployment, factories shut down, mines operating at less than full capacity, etc. This gap between the blue line and the green line represents the recessionary gap. The dotted blue line is where we're operating now. The solid green line is where we could operate if we were operating fully efficiently, and so the gap represents a recessionary gap. This always gets the attention of government leaders and policymakers, and when this happens, then they cast about for solutions. And one of the solutions we talked about in our second video clip is a fiscal stimulus solution. That means increasing government spending in order to boost the economy. And to do that, we would, on our graph, we would show a shift upwards of the blue line. And as it shifts upwards, it then crosses the red identity line further to the right, and that can close the recessionary gap. We talked about a multiplier effect in the second video, where an increase in government spending can potentially cause GDP to go up by a multiple of the government spending increase. The exact size of the multiplier is under a good deal of discussion and debate, and often depends on how the fiscal stimulus is applied, but nonetheless it is probably there to some extent. So here's a recessionary gap. It's not a place we'd like to be. High unemployment, income lower than it could be, and typically then government will step in, either through a fiscal stimulus with increased government spending, or the Federal Reserve through its monetary policy and influencing the money supply and interest rates can also close this gap and cause spending to go up. Let's go ahead and look at the counterpart, the inflationary gap. We have the same dotted blue line here that shows where our economy is operating right now, but in this scenario it is to the right of potential GDP. That means it's operating above potential GDP. Our output is actually higher than we can sustain in the long run. Remember, potential GDP is an efficient level of output, but it's also a sustainable level of output. And if we're operating beyond it or above it, then that's going to put a lot of stress on our scarce resources and cause what you can see here, an inflationary gap. We call it an inflationary gap because if indeed there's a lot of stress on the resources, too much demand chasing too few resources, that has the inevitable result of increasing prices and sending us into an inflationary spiral. That's a pretty painful thing for an economy to go through, and policymakers work hard to avoid getting ourselves into this situation where there is an inflationary gap. The typical response to avoid getting here or to get us out of an inflationary gap is for the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates by reducing the money supply. They can do that in sort of normal inflationary times when we're just trying to avoid getting into a true inflationary gap. The Federal Reserve can modestly increase interest rates, reducing the money supply, and cause the economy to cool down just a little bit to avoid getting into an inflationary gap. There have been times, particularly back in the early mid-1980s, when our economy got into a significant inflationary spiral. The inflation caused the economy to suffer. We actually had both high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. We call that a stagflation. And the Federal Reserve then was forced to aggressively increase interest rates in order to bring inflation under control. It was a pretty bitter medicine. The high interest rates made the recession even worse, but it was necessary in order to cool off the economy enough to bring to break the inflationary spiral. So we've just looked at the concept of potential GDP, how the best place for our economy to operate in the long run, and we looked briefly at situations where we're operating below that, i.e. in a recessionary gap, and a situation where the economy is operating temporarily above potential GDP and causing an inflationary gap. Both of these situations can and often are addressed using the tools of government, either fiscal policy or monetary policy.